Thank you so much to the organizers of the conference this year. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but nonetheless, I'm grateful to be here and participate. The ways women have collected, made visible, and valuable other women's photographic work are multiple, including how collecting mandates are developed, the direction of curatorial programs, and the creation and distribution of various publication initiatives. These efforts are both specific to photographic production or include women practitioners using photography in larger projects that fall under the umbrella of capital A art in the context of galleries and museums. Here I am reminded of, for example, the Fast Forward 2019 presentation by Lissa McCarty on her efforts at Duke University's Archive of Documentary Arts to build and create better discoverability of women's photographic work in the United States. Also in the US more broadly, but arguably from an intersectional feminist perspective, I am thinking too of the efforts of the Reparative Archival Description Working Group at Yale University's library, and the Reconnect, Recollect Reparative Connections to Philippine Collections at the University of Michigan. I am also reminded of the explosion of exhibitions of women's work more generally throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s. Here we think of WAC, Art and the Feminist Revolution, shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles in 2007. Lee Miller, A Woman's War at the Imperial War Museum in London in 2015. We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women and Radical Women Latin American Art, both in 2017 at the Brooklyn Museum in New York and the Hammer Museum, University of California, respectively. Dora Maar at Centre Pompidou in 2019. And Women in Revolt at the Tate Britain in London in 2023. In addition to these exhibitions and their catalogs garnering wide circulation, compendiums of women's photographic work have also been compiled. In 2020, A World History of Women Photographers was edited by Luce Labarre and Marie Robert and published by Textual, first in French, followed by an English edition published by Thames and Hudson. And in 2022, the University of Alberta Professor Emerita, Colleen Skidmore, published Rare Merit, Women in Photography in Canada. These exhibition catalogs and compendiums have indeed garnered wide circulation. And although much of this exhibition and publication activity absolutely brings increased visibility to work made beyond a male-dominated historical canon, if you will, it does little to address the systems, processes, procedures, and protocols constantly at work in the background that function to reinforce already concretized conceptions and criteria that delineate whose work is included or excluded in the historical record to begin with. In other words, simply taking what makes photographic work valid from an established, historically defined set of values and criteria and mapping it onto the work of women to essentially, quote unquote, rescue their work from oblivion, does very little to address. And here I echo the central tenets of feminist art historian Griselda Pollock's work, the structures that continue to ensure the marginalization of women's work in the first place. In this paper, I elucidate on this enduring problematic by thinking about archiving women's photographic output, accounting specifically for the unruly in the generation of archival records, and critically accounting for women's work that seemingly does not fit within the canonical controlled vocabularies of archiving standards and schematics used by institutions in their cataloging. In doing so, I focus primarily on aspects of women's photographers' archives held in the collection at the Image Center at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto, Canada, where I'm the archivist and research specialist. As one might guess, standards for archival work vary. Similar to citation standards for writing, like APA, MLA, or the Chicago Manual of Style, for example, the archival field has variations in its own manuals, like the Rules of Archival Description, or RAD, in Canada, or the various guidelines put forward by the International Council on Archives. For the purposes of this paper, I'd like to focus on cataloging cultural objects, or CCO, if you will, which is a standard we loosely reference at the Image Center in combination with some organizational schematics gleaned from RAD and other authority lists from the Getty and the Library of Congress in the United States. Unlike our Canadian archival standard RAD, which typically treats photographs solely as graphic material, CCO, although not without its problems, at least leaves room for photographs to be considered beyond their descriptive potential or status as neutral documents. To set the stage then, CCO is a set of best practices developed by the Visual Resources Association in the United States for describing, quote, museum collections, visual resource collections, archives, and libraries with a primary emphasis on art and architecture, end quote. It is specifically for the description of physical objects, as the authors state in the General Guidelines chapter, that are, quote, meant to be perceived primarily through the sense of sight, created by the use of skill and imagination, and exhibit an aesthetic of a quality and type that would be collected by museums and private collectors, end quote. This is, to be clear, a set of guidelines developed to standardize the description of architecture, plus objects made with the intention of being perceived as art solely through the sense of sight. Further, and more importantly, the criteria by which something is worth describing under CCO's umbrella is determined by what museums and private collectors deem of certain, yet undefined, aesthetic quality. In this paper, I look to the photographic work of American photographer Wendy Snyder McNeill and British photographer Joe Spence, whose archives were the first photographer's archive and the third, acquired at the Image Center respectively, and the first two archives of women photographers. Both McNeill and Spence worked with portraiture in different ways, centering family photographs and vernacular imagery as part of their practice, which included an engagement with snapshots, pictures of children, and family lineage and narratives, often told through proverbial Kodak moments, narrated by story. McNeill's project, Biographies, for example, was a work in progress between 1968 and 1975. In 1968, she began to photograph those closest to her, family, friends, and colleagues, and in 1973-74, received a Guggenheim grant to continue under the title An Intimate Landscape, which included work on a book of portraits, collected snapshots, and tape recordings. It was by the end of 1974 that McNeill was calling the project Biographies. And in 74-75 and again in 78-79, she procured grant funds from the National Endowment for the Arts to continue her work following the rejection of her book proposal by a publisher in Boston for what she had completed so far. Following that rejection, McNeill was forced to find another form for her work. Spence, after closing her professional portrait studio in the early 1970s, became involved in the Children's Rights Workshop in London, where she was involved in setting up a children's book project and reviewing books for feminist magazine Spare Rib and other publications. With the help of funding from the British Arts Council, the workshop also created a touring panel exhibition in 1973 titled Children Photographed, that interrogated the ways in which photography constructed views of childhood while exploring the various photographic styles used to do so. McNeill developed a new form for her work, large format, composite, platinum palladium portraits, garnering the title Album Pages. I argue that at the time, this positioned it to fit perfectly within the new milieu created for photography as an accepted form of individual artistic expression within the cultural spaces such as the fine art gallery and museum system. Her shift towards modes of artistic production that adhered to the language being developed to describe photography as art at the time positioned her work to be more easily described and accounted for within standards of description such as CCO. Spence, on the other hand, remained steadfast in her adherence to her socialist feminist politics of representation and photography as a tool for social change, both in the form and content of her work. This is not to say that McNeill caved or sold out, so to speak, but rather each photographer's choice in the context of their historical moment in the United Kingdom and the United States represents a unique set of considerations once their work crosses the proverbial boundary into the institutional archive and is subject to certain kinds of assessment and descriptive standards. In no uncertain terms, the 1970s were significant for photography's acceptance as a fine art. Its entrance into the gallery and museum system was widespread, both in Europe and North America. Primarily due to the legacy of Beaumont Newhall and his founding of the Museum of Modern Art's photography department in New York City in 1940, the continued development of new principles and connoisseurship emerged that functioned to sanction a canon of master photographers that were continually expanded and eventually supported by Newhall's successor, John Zerkowski, well into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And as American scholar Audrey Sands has aptly noted, an entire lexicon for positioning this idea of photography in art museums in the United States was developed. Words and phrases like individual vision, creative photography, concerned photography, and scholarship, quality, individual artist had by the late 1970s begun to be used to justify photography's entrance into the collections of large cultural institutions. Within these developments, McNeil's shift from snapshots, interviews, and audio recordings of her family members to large composite platinum palladium pictures on vellum, positioned as personal and artistic expressions, I argue, fit perfectly within the context of their making. In other words, efforts to differentiate and elevate photography's artistic value from its previous mass cultural associations, or what we might call too much Kodakery, if you will, meant that McNeil had to mold her work to this new emergent criteria in order to gain and maintain visibility and funding for her work. It is my contention that McNeil's shift to a more creative, individual vision means that her work adheres perfectly to institutional descriptive standards such as CCO, which are defined by the precise historical and discursive contexts that created them for photography to begin with. What then of the more explicitly unruly work that does not fit this mold? While it's imperative to understand how McNeil shifted her practice to ensure her work gained traction, how do we steward work that does not fit within the parameters of descriptive standards whatsoever? After closing her High Street portrait studio, Jo Spence became politically engaged, and her new political interest first found expression in her involvement, as I mentioned, volunteering at the Children's Rights Workshop in London. Founded by socialist activist Andrew Mann and Christine Vincent in 1973, Children's Rights Workshop focused on foregrounding and changing the underlying ideologies of children's literature. Spence was a distinct contributing member of the workshop who came with extensive experience as a visual worker, having owned and operated her own high street studio. Indeed, it was her self-reflection and exploration of her own assumptions, techniques, and methods, honed after years of creating conventional family photographs, that led her to the workshop and the creating of Children Photographed, the panel exhibition. And of course, having been a World War II child evacuee who lived in 11 different homes and changed schools 6 times, Spence understood what it meant to be young and feel powerless. Thus, at the workshop, she was involved in setting up the Children's Book Project with Mann and Vincent. She began reviewing books for Spare Rib and other magazines, and indeed interrogated the ways in which photography constructed views of childhood while exploring the various photographic styles used to do so. Indeed, Children Photograph was the first council-funded project that Spence was involved with. And it was she who planted the seed that became the sustaining impulse of the exhibition and the workshop's continued interrogation of the ways that both words and pictures function to reinforce stereotypes of children. How then do we account for this work when only the exhibition poster survives it and the panel project no longer exists in physical form? What does exist, however, is a verbal description of the work by Spence on an answering machine cassette from approximately the mid-1980s. On the cassette, a male caller is recorded, leaving Spence a message indicating his interest in the exhibition Children Photographed. During the recording of his message, he asked for additional information regarding the project. Halfway through his message, Spence picks up the phone. Unable to answer before the machine, the recording captures their entire conversation. In it, the caller asks questions, while Spence answers, explaining that the show went to Birmingham and subsequently went missing. She then describes the exhibition, how it was conceived, organized, and makes recommendations to various books and resources towards recreating it as a slide presentation, should the caller wish to. CCO, however, clearly stipulates that its guidelines account only for work comprehended through visual means. This is regardless of the fact that in the case of Spence and her polemical work, quote-unquote finished artwork was never the point, but rather the rhetoric of the image was always her main priority, and that throughout her life, photography was valued for its use and power as a tool of education and social and political change to be learned, picked up, and put into action by others. I therefore posit that children photograph does exist, albeit through an audio experience of language, and manifests as image only in the mind's eye. As feminist stewards of women's work, we must take into serious consideration archivist and historian Eric Ketteller's characterization of the archival turn in the mid-1990s. A turn that viewed archives not as repositories of documents, but rather sites of knowledge creation and power, whereby the original does not necessarily reside in a repository as an official record, but also in individuals' minds as memory. This forces a necessary refocusing of the archivist's role. It cannot only account for the inactive stage of the life of recorded information, it must also include accounting for the front end of the record's continuum. In other words, the archivist professional must understand the way people, and in this case, women photographers, create and maintain their records and archives. To arrive at such an understanding, one must consider the stage that precedes institutional and professional archiving. He calls this, quote, archivalization, a neologism denoting the conscious or unconscious choice determined by social and cultural factors to consider something worth archiving, end quote. I contend that McNeil's and Spence's work signals broader debates taking place within feminist movements since the 1970s and 80s between the spheres of what we think of as cultural feminism, or women taking up space in sanctioned venues of cultural production, and socialist feminism, women's work taking place outside those spaces, motivated by the desire to change them, respectively. Thus, McNeil's work fits perfectly into the kind of descriptive standards set forth in CCO. As a woman practitioner and fine art teacher, McNeil's work took up residence in male-dominated cultural spaces, and she held her own, gaining at least some visibility to express her ideas about photography and portraiture within the gallery and museum system in the United States. However, she also considered her audio recordings, interview transcripts, and family snapshots that comprised her rejected book project biographies worth archiving. Children photographed is utterly missing, and under the auspices of CCO is non-existent. Yet Joe Spence deemed her recorded answering machine message description of the project worth archiving. And the sonic recording of the project description by Spence, sharing the resources of its creation, explaining the sections of each panel, and advising on how it could be remade by someone else as a slideshow, embody her socialist feminist ideals. It is a total embodiment of how Spence envisioned her activist archive as a resource for others, a directive on how to recreate it and use it for one's own purposes, a signification of the central driving force behind any manifestation of Spence's photographic work: education, engagement, action, and the use value of photography as a tool for interrogating systems of power towards social change. Thus, instead of giving the audio recording a commonly accepted file description of, quote, miscellaneous audio cassettes, circa 1985, end quote, this sonic remembering receives the simple item-level description. Children photographed, 1975, described by Joe Spence on audio cassette for use and recreation as a slide presentation, circa 1985. The discursive context of how women photographers shape-shift their way towards visibility and voice must be accounted for when their work is institutionally stewarded. We must be cautious to not only account for quote-unquote finished work, that is siphoned off and redistributed into narrow definitions that distill it down to fine art definitions and package it only as potential capital A art products. I have tried in this paper to critically question the capacity for guidelines such as CCO to capture the full dimensionality of photographic work done by women beyond what is already predetermined by descriptive standards. In doing so, I hope to continue accounting for the full gamut of women's photographic work so that ultimately its full scope is accessible in perpetuity. Thank you very much.